Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Mhm.
And today we are going back to the 1960s,
Oh, wow.
to Cincinnati,
Okay.
a time and place that honestly just became synonymous with a really terrifying figure,
Yeah.
the Cincinnati Strangler.
Right.
And, you guys sent over some incredible sources, a lot of info from Wikipedia, so let's just dive in
Yeah, let's unravel this case.
and try to figure this whole thing out.
It's one of those cases that I feel like just gripped the city,
Yeah,
you know? And when we hear strangler, we're talking about someone who uses just their bare hands
right.
or sometimes a ligature to cut off someone's airway. It's a very personal and violent way to kill.
Yeah, and I think that personal nature just adds to the fear factor, right? Because it could happen to anyone.
Exactly. And, especially when you think about the victims in this case, these
Yeah.
weren't random attacks at all. 7 women, all living in various housing complexes, were targeted over just 1 year
Wow.
between 1965 and 1966. And their ages range from 31 to 81. So it's highlighting, a terrifying vulnerability among women in those communities.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really stood out to me from the sources you sent was just how much this case shook Cincinnati. I mean, we even saw that Halloween was moved to Sunday afternoons
Oh, wow.
for 2 years because parents were just too scared to let their kids trick-or-treat at night.
That's a fascinating detail. It really shows just the level of fear and paranoia that took over the city.
Totally.
This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a wave of terror that just totally changed daily life.
Right.
And that's where I think the term moral panic comes in. This widespread fear, often irrational, that some evil is threatening society.
Yeah, it's almost like this collective anxiety that takes over.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin to unpack the timeline of these murders?
Well, the first victim, Emma Jean Harrington, was found strangled in December of 1965.
Okay.
And the brutality just escalated, with each subsequent murder culminating in the final victim, 81-year-old Lula Carrick.
Yeah, and Carrick's case is particularly disturbing, right?
Absolutely. She was attacked and strangled with her own stocking in an elevator.
Oh my gosh.
And that detail, it just drove home the point that nowhere felt safe.
Right, it could happen anywhere.
Exactly.
But it's interesting because not all the victims met the same fate. There's one case that really stands out as a turning point.
Yes.
The murder of Barbara Bowman.
Ah, yes. Barbara Bowman, she was only 31. The youngest victim, and her murder was unique in several ways. Unlike the others, she was stabbed, not strangled.
And she was last seen leaving a bar and getting into a taxi.
Right.
Driven by a young black man.
Okay.
And that taxi turned out to be stolen from the yellow cab company.
Oh, wow.
And this is where it gets interesting. The cab number was 186.
Okay, so that number becomes a crucial clue.
Yeah.
Now, Bowman's murder really shook the city to its core. I think the seemingly random nature of the attack, a young woman just enjoying a night out, it really fueled the panic.
Yeah, it's like this case shattered whatever sense of security was left in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I mean, weapon and lock sales went through the roof.
Yeah.
Nightlife died down. People were just terrified.
It's just a grim illustration of how fear can just grip a community, how it can change behavior and everyday life.
Yeah, for sure. And in the midst of all this chaos, the police arrest Posteal Laskey Jr.
Okay.
He was a 29-year-old laborer and aspiring musician. What led the police to him?
Well, potential victim, Sandra Chapez, managed to escape an attack, and she reported his license plate to the police, a close call.
Oh my gosh.
I know, right?
So Laskey is apprehended. What happens next?
Well, investigators start digging into his background and uncover some troubling information. Laskey had a prior assault conviction and was on probation at the time of the murders.
Okay, so that definitely raises some red flags.
Right. And then they discover something even more intriguing. Laskey had previously worked as a driver for, wait for it, the Yellow Cab Company.
No way.
Yes.
During the same period when all their cars used identical ignition keys? There's no way that's a coincidence.
Right. And it's not the company confirmed that Laskey had actually kept the ignition key for car number 186 after he was fired, along with some other company property.
Wow. Okay, so we have a suspect with a history of violence, and he just happens to have the key to the stolen cab linked to Barbara Bowman's murder. That's pretty damning, wouldn't you say?
It's certainly compelling evidence, although it's important to remember it's circumstantial. There's no direct proof linking him to the strangulations themselves.
Right.
However, as the investigation continues, more pieces of the puzzle fall into place. Witnesses place Laskey as the driver of the taxi Bowman got into that night.
Hold on, before we go any further. It's already getting pretty intense. Let's pause here for a moment so you can catch your breath
Yeah.
and absorb everything we've covered so far. We'll pick up with the rest of the investigation in part 2.
So are we ready to jump back into this crazy case?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, we left off with some pretty strong evidence pointing to Laskey. What else did investigators find out?
Well, on top of those witness statements, putting him with Bowman, two other women actually came forward accusing Lasky of robbing them around the same time as the murders.
Okay, so now we're not just talking about one murder anymore. These robbery
Well,
accusations. I mean, they suggest a pattern of behavior that lines up with the strangulations.
exactly. And even though there wasn't any, direct evidence tying Lasky to the strangulations themselves, all those pieces, the assault history, the cab key, the witness statements, and the robbery accusations, they really started to paint a clear picture.
Yeah, it sounds like the prosecution had a pretty solid case. Did they just focus on Bowman's murder, or did they try to link him to the other 6 deaths too?
That's where things get a little tricky. You see, while the police and the media heavily implied that Lasky was guilty of all 7 murders, he was only ever charged and tried for Bowman's death.
Interesting. So what happened at the trial?
Well, in 1967, Posteal Laskey Jr. was convicted of Barbara Bowman's murder, and he was sentenced to death. Pretty dramatic turn of events for the aspiring musician.
Wow, a death sentence? That's huge. What happened after that? Did he appeal?
Lasky always said he was innocent not just in Bowman's murder, but in all the strangulations. And his death sentence was eventually changed to life in prison, and he spent decades behind bars, repeatedly denied parole.
So even though he was only convicted of 1 murder, he still ended up serving a life sentence, it seems like. The authorities, and maybe even the public, believed he was responsible for all the deaths, even without concrete proof.
That's the thing, public perception doesn't always match up with the actual facts of a case. And just because the killing stopped after Lasky was arrested doesn't necessarily mean he was the only one doing it.
I see what you mean. It's totally possible there were other things going on that we might never know about.
Hmm.
But what about the key evidence like the cab key? Wouldn't that also point to Lasky and the other murders?
Well, that's a good point. But remember, none of the other victims were connected to a Tassie, and we can't rule out the possibility that someone else might have been involved, maybe even a copycat killer working in the shadows.
Okay, now that's a scary thought. So what eventually happened to Posteal Laskey Jr.?
He died in prison in 2007, still claiming he was innocent in the other 6 strangulations, and his death pretty much closed the book on the case, at least officially.
But probably not in the minds of the people who still wonder if the real Cincinnati Strangler was ever actually caught. It sounds like this case, even with the conviction, is full of unanswered questions and what-ifs.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just looking at a cold case here. We're exploring the unknowns and the human side of these investigations.
Right. Even with all the evidence and the trial and the conviction, there are still holes in the story, leaving room for doubt and debate.
Exactly. And, this case also brings up a big question about how we as a society deal with fear and uncertainty. Remember that moral panic we talked about earlier, the way the city reacted, moving Halloween, stepping up security. It shows just how much power fear has to change how we act.
It's like a reminder that even when the threat seems to be gone, that fear can stick around and affect our choices and how we see things long after the initial panic is over.
Mm.
So to sum it all up, we have 7 women, murdered a city, consumed by terror, a suspect with a shady past, a trial that gripped the nation, and a conviction that only partially answered the big question, who was the Cincinnati Strangler?
And that takes us to the core of this deep dive. Was Posteal Laskey Jr. really behind all 7 deaths, or did he become the face of a string of crimes that might have involved someone else, someone who was never caught?
It's a question that still haunts true crime fans and historians.
It definitely does, and this is where things get really interesting because we have to shift, from the investigation itself and look more at how this case is still being seen and talked about today. It's like the Cincinnati Strangler almost became this legendary figure.
Right, and that's what I think what makes true crime so captivating. It's not just about the facts of a case. It's the human element, the impact on the community, and the mysteries that spark these conversations for years.
Exactly. It pulls us in. It makes us think about those real life complexities, grapple with the unknowns, and try to form our own opinions based on what's out there.
So, after going so deep into all of this, what are your thoughts? Do you think Posteal Laskey Jr. was really the Cincinnati Strangler behind all 7 of those deaths, or do you think maybe there was another killer or even a copycat out there at the same time?
It's a tough one, isn't it? There's strong evidence against Lasky, especially in Bowman's case, but those missing links to the other strangulations definitely leave some doubt. And that's where critical thinking is so important. We can't just take the official story as fact. We have to look at everything, consider other theories, and just admit that there are limits to what we can really know for sure.
And that's what makes these deep dives so great. It's not just about listening, it's about thinking for ourselves, forming our own opinions, maybe even finding new angles.
Exactly. Who knows? Maybe by looking into this yourself, you'll come to a different conclusion, a whole new perspective that sheds light on this mystery. The Cincinnati Strangler case might never truly be solved, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep exploring and analyzing it.
That's a great point. I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. We've explored this dark part of Cincinnati's history, a time full of fear, uncertainty, and so many questions. We've dug into the details of the crimes, the investigation that led to Posteal Laskey Jr.'s conviction, and those lingering doubts that still spark debate today.
It's a case that reminds us that criminal justice is complex, that fear is powerful, and that we have to be critical thinkers when we're looking at any story, even if it's presented as fact.
Well said. Thanks for walking us through this deep dive. And to everyone listening, we encourage you to check out those sources, examine the evidence, and come to your own conclusions. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.